Thank you so much, sir, for speaking to WION. My first question to you is, how has the European security architecture changed since the conflict started, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine started last year?
So what we have seen is a war aggression launched by President Putin and the leadership in Moscow against a sovereign, independent nation with international recognized borders. And what allies have done is that we have provided support to Ukraine, because you have to remember what this is. This is a war aggression where we have an aggressor, Russia, invading another country, Ukraine, and it is enshrined in the UN Charter as part of international law that when attacked, when you are a victim of aggression, you have the right for self-defense. So Ukraine defend itself, and NATO allies help Ukraine to uphold the right of self-defense. We are not party to the conflict, but we support Ukraine in their rightful right to defend against aggression.
There have been drone strikes inside Russia. Do you think that it's going to escalate the conflict outside the ongoing situation in Ukraine?
Wars are dangerous because there's always a risk that things may escalate and come out of control. Therefore, NATO's task is partly to provide support to Ukraine, as we do, to help them defend themselves, but also to prevent this war from escalating beyond Ukraine and to become a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia. And to do that, we have increased our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance. We are a defensive alliance, but by having forces in the eastern part of NATO, we are sending a message to Moscow. We are removing any room for miscalculation, misunderstanding in Moscow about our readiness to protect and defend all allies. And by sending that message, we are preventing escalation, we are preserving peace. The war in Ukraine is a tragedy. We see a lot of human suffering, but of course a full-fledged war will be many times worse, and therefore we need to, in Europe, and therefore we need to prevent that by sending a clear message to Moscow. Of course, it is dangerous when we have full-fledged war in Europe. It was President Putin that started this war, and President Putin can end this war, and that's the best way to prevent any risk for escalation or for more human suffering.
While European capitals are very worried about the conflict, there are concerns in the Indo-Pacific as well. The Chinese aggressive actions in the region has been a concerning development for countries like India, for Japan. How does NATO sees that, the ongoing Chinese aggressive actions, but also its actions towards India in India's northern borders?
So we are concerned about China's more coercive behavior and the way they try to coerce neighbors and to threaten neighbors. We have seen it in the South China Sea, we have seen it in the Indian Ocean. And of course this highlights that security is global. NATO will remain a regional alliance of North America and Europe, but what happens in the Indian Ocean or in the South China Sea also matters for our security, as it matters, of course, for the countries in the region. And therefore, we are working more closely with our close partners, the Indo-Pacific partners, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. And I think it is a potential for also NATO and India to work more closely together. But of course, that has to also be something that is wanted from India, but on maritime security, on cyber, on the effects of climate change on our security. These are issues where I think there is a potential for actually doing more together.
So you mentioned about India and the NATO. There have been conversations in the past between the two sides. What are these conversations all about? And can we see some kind of future cooperation as well between India and NATO? What kind of, indications you have got from New Delhi?
So NATO is the alliance of North America and Europe, but we have global partners in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific, because we want to work together with partners, mutual interest to stay more closer together, especially in a world when we see that authoritarian regimes, China and Russia are coming closer and closer. Just before the invasion of Ukraine, China and Russia signed a declaration saying that their partnership has no limits. And we see how Russia and China have more naval patrols, more air patrols. They had just had a big joint naval exercise off the coast of Africa, so not so far from the Indian Sea, actually. This matters for NATO, it matters for India, it matters for countries in many places in the world, and therefore we see value in strengthening our ties, our relationship with other democratic nations. India is the biggest democracy in the world. Nations that share our values, that believes in a rules-based international order, to work more closer to them, not because we agree on all issues, but because we share the same basic values. International law, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and therefore we should, I think there is a potential in working more closely together.
When it comes to India, how do you see India's role in resolving the ongoing conflict? Do you see India's role in resolving the ongoing conflict? Because the Chinese have been putting up their own ideas, and India has been saying, as the Indian Prime Minister said, that this is not an era of war.
Ukraine has been attacked. Significant parts of their territory is occupied by Russia. And of course, we have to make sure that a ceasefire or any other pause in the war is not just an excuse for Russia to regroup, to rearm, to reconstitute, and then to rest, and then to launch new attacks. Because the war against Ukraine didn't start in February last year. It started in 2014. That was when Russia annexed Crimea, and later on the same year went into eastern Donbass. And since then there have been attempts to negotiate ceasefires. We had something called the Minsk agreements, but fundamentally there has been a conflict going on there since 2014.
Well, thank you so much for speaking to WION. It was a pleasure speaking to you, sir, here in Oslo, Norway. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for having me.